Section 3. Faith and Works. Chapter 7. Pray without ceasing. Pray without ceasing. 1 Thessalonians 5:17. God moves in mysterious ways is an old adage that could not be truer to what we experienced with the Lord, especially at the beginning of King's Garden. Situations arose that made absolutely no sense to our natural minds, but when we closed our eyes in prayer and saw with the eyes of our understanding, God would show us our ordered steps. One of the most curious circumstances, which at first had us all scratching our heads, turned out to be a blessing that only God could have orchestrated. This blessing not only led to a miraculous healing, but also a ministry of prayer that was unceasing for over 10 years. To tell this story, I need to hop off our timeline and go back to the weeks before we moved to King's Garden, when we sent out the first circular letter, sharing with people how the Lord had promised to give us the old Furland Sanatorium and asking them to pray and to give. One of the letters found its way to the home of Cappy Frisbee. Several years before, Mrs. Frisbee had had a cerebral hemorrhage and was confined to her bed for a long period of time. During this time, she began to listen to a radio, and one day, after listening to a gospel message, she gave her heart to the Lord. Her body began to improve, so she used her vitality to witness in many places for the Lord. Unfortunately, she had a relapse and became partially paralyzed once more. Again, she spent her convalescence listening to Christian radio and heard a message asking for listeners to surrender their lives to the Lord and give all to Him, anything the Lord asked of them. This dear lady committed to God and told Him He could have anything she had. The morning our letter came to her, the Lord began to reveal to her that since she had surrendered her life to Him, she should accept that which He sent to her. He also told her that the letter which had come, and which she had carelessly tossed unopened into the wastebasket, was something He wanted her to read, that He had caused it to be sent to her. She retrieved the letter and read it, and she heard the Lord ask her to donate her home to help start the work of King's Garden. Then came the mysterious part. She knew He told her that a miraculous healing in her body would be on the other side of her obedience. Cappy wasted no time in calling Mike and asking him to visit her beautiful home built on the edge of a lake. When Mike arrived, he saw a woman partially paralyzed, clad in pajamas, with hair that hung in long braids. She excitedly shared what she believed the Lord instructed her to do: sell her home, give the proceeds to King's Garden, and receive her total healing. Mike was very fearful at this news and told her we could not take her home until he had permission from the corporate board. He promised her that the board members would pray and seek to find God's will in the matter. After much prayer and several meetings, the board members went to see Mrs. Frisbee to reason with her, to try and convince her to keep her home, but she kept insisting that we must take her home so that she could be healed. Naturally, the board was concerned that people would observe this and believe we were taking advantage of one who was ill. But she was so entirely sure on the matter, the board kept praying to seek the will of God. We sought counsel, both of the Lord and of trusted advisors, and the day finally came when the King's Garden board members decided it must be the will of the Lord to accept the gift of this home, and that it was His provision for the work of King's Garden. Just before we moved out to the property, Mike told her we would sign the papers accepting this gift. She rejoiced at this news. Shortly after, Mike and the secretary of the board completed all the necessary legal transactions to transfer her home into the assets of King's Garden. Then Mike drove to thank Mrs. Frisbee once again for her generosity. When he arrived at her home, he expected to go into her house and tell her the news. Instead, she saw Mike coming. The moment Mike parked, she ran out and jumped into the car. Cappy had been completely healed of her paralysis. Laughing with sheer joy, she exclaimed, "I feel just like a gazelle." When they compared the time when the papers were signed and when she was healed, they found it was exactly at the same time. What a tremendous miracle! Everyone involved in deciding to trust that Mrs. Frisbee had indeed heard the Lord correctly about this unique situation praised the Lord for His faithfulness to this precious woman. Cappy continued to give generously to King's Garden, and eventually she moved into a small cabin on the grounds. She felt that the Lord was calling her to a full-time ministry of prayer at King's Garden. She prayed practically all day long for the different ministries, and one of her major ministries was to pray specifically for Mike so that he would have the wisdom to make the right decisions as they came up. Often, when Mike was facing a difficult choice or problem and did not know what to do, he would go to Cappy and pray with her. One day, Mike was feeling depressed because Christian people were severely and publicly criticizing him for starting King's Garden. He went down to pray with Cappy. He thought Cappy would sympathize with him, but instead she asked sharply, "Mike, are you counting this all joy?" It was a convicting lesson for Mike that he never forgot. From then on, he tried to count any challenging trial that came his way as all joy. Other workers, too, when they needed spiritual help, would wind their way to Cappy's little cabin, and there they found the encouragement and help they needed. For a few years, too, she walked around the garden daily and looked for those workers who seemed to be discouraged and would ask them to pray with her. A few times when Mike told her of some ministry the Lord seemed to be leading him into, she would simply say, "I prayed for that to happen years ago." Cappy is home with the Lord now, and the last few years of her life were spent in much suffering. Even then, she would pray fervently for the work. Only eternity will reveal all that Cappy accomplished through her prayer, but I am sure her reward in heaven is overflowing. Hers was a completely dedicated life, and I know King's Garden would not have come into being if it had not been for Cappy's complete obedience to the Lord. The fragrance of her spirit-filled life will always linger at the King's Garden. I know she had an abundant entrance into the everlasting kingdom of the Lord when she went to be with him in 1960.